Welcome to Whispers of History, where forgotten tales, strange events, and mysterious moments from the past come alive. One whisper at a time. Subscribe, relax, and let the past whisper you to sleep. Before the clinking of glasses beneath glittering chandeliers. Before the stream of golden bubbles rising in a flute. There was only the stillness of an abbey. It was not a place of noise or celebration, but of quiet prayer, careful work, and the gentle rhythm of days measured not by hours, but by bells. You may have heard the name Dom Pérignon whispered in connection with luxury and festivity, but he was no worldly merchant or nobleman. He was a Benedictine monk, devoted not to fame, but to the perfection of a humble craft, making wine for the abbey and for the pilgrims who passed through. His story begins in the gentle hills of Champagne, France. In the 17th century, the air was cool. The winters long, and the vines that grew in that chalky soil were stubborn in their yield. From this unassuming place, through patience and persistence, would come one of the world's most celebrated drinks. But tonight, we will walk slowly through his world. We will see the stones of the abbey warmed by afternoon sun, the careful tending of grapes through the seasons, and the moment when the problem of exploding bottles quietly became the miracle of champagne. Let the present day fade away, and allow your mind to rest in the dim, peaceful cellars of Hautvillers Abbey, where it all began. The Abbey of Hautvillers sat like a patient guardian above the Marne Valley, its weathered stones holding centuries of quiet labor. Here, life followed an unchanging rhythm: dawn prayers in the chapel, work in the gardens and vineyards, the midday meal taken in silence, evening chants beneath flickering candlelight. For the monks, the world beyond the abbey walls might as well have been another century. The bells were the heartbeat of the place. They called the brothers from rest to prayer, from prayer to work, and from work to reflection. Each toll rolled gently across the valley, carrying with it a sense of timelessness. Dom Pérignon arrived here in 1668, a man in his late 20s. Already known for his skill with vines, he had taken his vows not to pursue wealth, but to serve God through discipline, devotion, and labor. In the Benedictine tradition, every task, from scrubbing floors to blending wine, was an act of worship. In Champagne, wine was both necessity and offering. It was poured for visiting dignitaries, sold to support the abbey's upkeep, and shared at religious festivals. But the local wine was stubborn. The climate brought short summers, early frosts, and a strange quirk: fermentation sometimes stopped in winter, only to start again in spring, causing chaos in the cellars. The land around Hautvillers was beautiful, but beauty was not enough for good wine. Dom Pérignon quickly became known for walking the vineyards with almost meditative slowness, studying each cluster of grapes, feeling the soil with his hands, tasting the berries to judge their readiness. He believed in blending grapes from different parcels to create a harmony of flavors, a radical idea for his time. The abbey's cellars were cool and dark, lined with barrels of wine aging in the quiet. The smell was a mix of damp stone, oak, and the faint sweetness of fermenting fruit. It was in these cellars that Pérignon would begin his life's work. Days at Hautvillers passed with deliberate stillness. The monks rose before dawn, washed in cold water, and gathered in the chapel for matins. The air at that hour carried a faint scent of smoke from the night's embers, mingled with the chill of stone floors under bare feet. After prayers came the work, and for Pérignon, that meant walking between rows of vines or checking the progress of fermenting wine. He kept meticulous records, noting which slopes caught the morning sun first, which plots resisted frost, and how each combination of grapes behaved in the cask. His goal was simple but ambitious: to make the best wine in France. Visitors to the abbey often remarked on the quiet efficiency of its operations. Every monk had a role, and each role fit neatly into the whole. Some tended the gardens, others baked bread, some cared for the sick, but the vineyards and cellars remained central to Hautvillers' livelihood. Pérignon's humility was as notable as his skill. He did not boast about his wine, but he took quiet pride in its clarity, flavor, and balance. he rejected inferior grapes and refused to add anything artificial, insisting that purity was the heart of excellence. In the evenings, after Vespers, the monks would sometimes gather in the cloister garden. The stone arches framed a view of the valley, where the last light lingered on the hills before slipping into dusk. There, Pérignon might share a quiet word with another brother about the day's work, perhaps remarking on the sweetness of this year's harvest or the trouble with a certain batch. The world beyond the abbey, of court intrigue, wars, and politics, seemed far away, and yet, it would not be long before something in these quiet hills drew the attention of kings. But before that came the problem. Winter was the hidden enemy of Champagne's winemakers. When the cold arrived, fermentation would stop, leaving wine unfinished. The monks bottled it, thinking it safe, but when spring warmth returned, the yeast awoke, and pressure built inside the bottles until they shattered, sometimes in great numbers. It was a costly mess, and a dangerous one. For most, this was simply an unfortunate hazard. But for Pérignon, it was a puzzle worth solving. He did not yet dream of a drink filled with bubbles. He dreamed of a wine that would be still, clear, and perfect, and so, with patience, he began to study the patterns, the seasons, the behavior of the yeast, the strength of the bottles. His journey had begun. Though he could not yet know where it would lead, the abbey bell tolled again, marking Compline, the final prayer of the day. The monks moved through the corridors in silence, their footsteps echoing softly. The stars above Champagne shone with quiet brilliance, indifferent to the work below. And in that silent world of prayer, patience, and persistence, the seeds of Champagne's story were planted. The Marne Valley was a place of patience. Vines did not grow in haste here. They curled slowly around their wooden stakes, feeling the turning of the seasons as the monks felt the rhythm of their prayers. The soil, chalky, pale, and stubborn, was both a gift and a challenge. Its whiteness reflected the sun, keeping grapes warm in short summers, and its dryness forced the roots to dig deep, searching for water. This, the monks knew, gave the grapes a character unlike any other. The valley's air carried scents that changed with the months, the faint sweetness of blossoms in spring, the green, sun-warmed leaves in summer, the earthy dampness of autumn rain. Dom Pérignon walked these slopes often, his robe brushing against the grass, his eyes scanning each vine as though greeting an old friend. The vineyards around Hautvillers were planted with three main varieties of grape, Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay. Each had its temperament. Pinot Noir, dark-skinned and bold, gave body and structure to the wine. Pinot Meunier, more forgiving, thrived in cooler spots, bringing a soft fruitiness. Chardonnay, pale, almost translucent, offered elegance and a gentle fragrance. Dom Pérignon believed that no single grape should dominate. Instead, they should be blended, each lending its voice to a quiet harmony. This was unusual thinking in his time. Many growers simply harvested what they had, letting nature decide the character of the wine each year. But Pérignon sought something more consistent, more deliberate, a wine that could be relied upon for its quality, year after year. The work in the vineyards was constant. In winter, when the land slept, the monks pruned the vines with care, cutting back growth to ensure stronger fruit in the seasons ahead. In spring, they tied new shoots to the stakes, protecting them from wind. Summer brought the careful removal of excess leaves to let the sun reach the grapes, and autumn was the time of harvest, a quiet celebration of patience rewarded. Harvest at Hautvillers was not hurried. The monks moved in steady lines down the rows, hands working gently, placing each bunch into wicker baskets. The air was filled with the soft rustle of leaves, the faint thud of grapes settling in the basket, and the low murmur of Latin hymns sung under their breath. Once gathered, the grapes were carried to the abbey's courtyard. Here, a wooden press stood ready, its beams worn smooth from years of use. The monks worked together, turning the great screw to release the juice, which flowed in a slow, steady stream into waiting barrels. The scent at this moment was rich and full, green and floral at first, then deepening into something rounder, sweeter, almost like honey. Dom Pérignon oversaw every stage, tasting the juice, inspecting the skins, noting the clarity. If a batch did not meet his standards, it was set aside without hesitation. The Marne Valley's climate was capricious. Some years brought early frosts that threatened the crop. Others gave sudden storms that split the grapes on the vine, but in the best years, when the sun was generous and the rains fell just enough, the grapes were touched with a rare perfection. It was in such years that Pérignon felt closest to his goal. Wine in this era was not a luxury for the monks, it was a necessity, part of their daily sustenance, safer to drink than much of the water, but beyond its practical use, it carried a symbolic weight, a connection to the sacrament. Reminder of the vine and the branches. On quiet afternoons, Dom Pérignon would sometimes sit at the edge of the vineyard, ledger open on his lap, making notes about the soil's condition, the flavor of the grapes, the behavior of each plot. His writing was precise, his observations steady. He was not chasing novelty, he was pursuing mastery. The Marne Valley was his classroom, his chapel, and his laboratory all at once. The vines did not hurry, and neither did he. It was here, among the rows of grapes, that the quiet foundations of Champagne were laid, not in a single moment of discovery, but in countless days of watchful care. Each evening, the monks returned from the fields with the same slow, measured pace. They brought with them not just baskets of grapes, but the satisfaction of work done well, and in the cellars beneath Hautvillers Abbey, those grapes would begin their transformation. The cellars of Hautvillers Abbey were never truly silent, even in the deepest hours of the night, when the monks slept and the wind whispered outside, the darkness below the abbey seemed alive. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of earth, oak, and the faint tang of fermenting wine. In the flicker of a lantern, the barrels rested like great sleeping beasts, their iron hoops catching glints of gold in the light. Dom Pérignon often lingered there after the others had gone, notebook in hand, listening to the faint hiss and sigh of the wine as it worked quietly in its casks. The transformation from grape to wine was, in theory, well understood. Grapes were pressed, juice was stored. Yeast consumed sugars, and fermentation produced the drink the monks relied upon. Yet here, in the Champagne region, the cold northern winters played tricks with nature. The chill would come early, freezing the yeast into dormancy before its work was complete. The wine would be bottled in the first flush of spring, believed to be stable, ready for storage or travel. But the warmth of the season woke the sleeping yeast. The fermentation began again, inside sealed bottles. The results were startling. Sometimes it began with a faint popping noise, barely noticed above the rustle of robes or the echo of footsteps. Other times it was violent, the sharp crack of glass shattering in the dark, sending shards skittering across the stone floor. Bottles burst without warning, spraying the sweet, fizzy wine in sticky arcs. One broken bottle could trigger others nearby, a chain reaction that left the cellar floor littered with glittering fragments and wasted wine. Dom Pérignon found himself confronting a mystery that confounded many winemakers of his day. The people of Champagne had no intention of making a sparkling wine. The bubbles were considered a flaw, a mark of imperfection. The English, oddly, seemed to have a taste for it, but here, in the abbey, it was seen as wasted effort, a failed batch. Still, Pérignon could not ignore the phenomenon. It was dangerous, costly, and frustrating to the monks who worked so hard to produce a steady, reliable drink. The cellar itself became a place of tension. The monks walked more carefully, ears attuned to the faintest sound. At night, the echoes of corks popping could be heard from the dormitories above, a sound like musket fire in miniature. Dom Pérignon began keeping meticulous records, noting which batches were most prone to bursting, which varieties of grapes seemed more susceptible, and how the cellar's temperature changed with the seasons. He measured, observed, and listened. The wine spoke in its own language, fizzing, hissing, sometimes roaring to life. the problem was not unique to Hautvillers. Across the region, winemakers lost large portions of their stock each year to the same fate. Some abandoned bottling entirely, preferring to sell wine in barrels where the pressure could escape harmlessly. But barrels were impractical for travel and for the abbey's modest trade with nearby towns. Bottles were the future, if only they could be made safe. The deeper Pérignon looked into the issue, the more he began to see that it was not simply a problem of failure, it was a clue. The bubbles, though uninvited, brought a brightness and lift to the wine. When the explosion did not happen, the surviving bottles carried a curious liveliness on the tongue, an energy that felt almost celebratory. Still, the damage to the abbey's reserves was impossible to ignore. The monk spoke of the devil's wine, half in jest, half in genuine concern. And as much as Dom Pérignon disliked waste, he disliked mystery even more. He began testing bottle placement, experimenting with storage methods, and taking note of when bursts occurred most often. Some weeks were quiet. Others sounded like a battlefield. It became clear that the weakness was in part due to the bottles themselves. French glass, though beautiful, was thin and brittle. A single flaw in its shape could cause it to burst under the pressure of reawakened fermentation. English glass, made in coal-fired furnaces, was stronger, but expensive and not always easy to obtain. And then there was the cork. At the time, sealing wine was an inexact science. Some bottles used wooden stoppers wrapped in oil-soaked cloth, others used rudimentary corks that leaked or loosened. The pressure inside these bottles was relentless, an invisible force that could split wood and send a cork flying like a stone from a sling. Dom Pérignon could have accepted the loss as a fact of life in the cold north. Instead, he began thinking of the problem as a riddle, one that might lead, if solved, to something new. He examined the wines that survived their second fermentation and found them alive with aroma and sparkle. They were, in their way, beautiful accidents. The abbey's cellars became both a laboratory and a battlefield. Monks moved through them with equal measures of reverence and caution. Every bottle was a potential treasure, or a small bomb. One late winter night, when the air outside bit at the skin and the stars above were sharp as needles, Dom Pérignon stood alone in the cellar, a single surviving bottle in his hands. He could feel the faint vibration inside, the wine alive and restless. He did not yet know how to tame it. But he was beginning to understand that it should not be destroyed, it should be mastered. Above ground, the vines still slept under their blanket of frost, unaware that in the shadows below, a quiet revolution was taking shape. Dom Pérignon's quest had begun, not to eliminate the bubbles, but to learn their nature, and perhaps, one day, to welcome them. The cellar was no longer just a storehouse for the abbey's wine. In Dom Pérignon's hands, it had become a place of inquiry. The rows of barrels and bottles were now test subjects, and the quiet Benedictine monk had taken on the role of investigator, patient, precise, and unwilling to accept defeat. In the weeks after yet another round of bursting bottles, Pérignon devised a plan. Instead of bottling all the wine in one manner, he would vary everything: glass thickness, cork type, grape blend, fermentation time. The abbey's resources were modest, but his curiosity was boundless. He began with the grapes themselves. Pérignon believed that blending varieties could yield a wine of greater stability, not just greater flavor. He experimented with the proportions of Pinot Noir, Pinot Meunier, and Chardonnay, keeping careful notes on how each behaved during and after fermentation. Fermentation was another puzzle. Pérignon adjusted the timing of pressing and racking, sometimes leaving the wine in barrels longer before bottling, sometimes shortening the time. He listened closely to the wine, as if it might whisper the secret if he was attentive enough. One challenge was temperature. The cold winters of Champagne made it nearly impossible to control fermentation consistently. The monks could not heat their vast stone cellars without risking spoilage. Pérignon experimented with storing some batches deeper underground where the temperature remained more constant, and others nearer the surface where they might warm more quickly in spring. He also turned his attention to the bottles. Though English glass was stronger, importing it was costly. Still, he secured a small number to test against the local French bottles. His records showed fewer bursts with the thicker, coal-fired glass, though the expense remained a problem. Then there was the question of sealing. Wooden plugs wrapped in oil-soaked cloth were traditional, but they leaked. Natural cork from Spain seemed promising. Its flexibility allowed it to seal tightly yet be removed without breaking. Pérignon began experimenting with corks of varying lengths and densities, securing them with hemp twine and wax. At first, the results were mixed. Some bottles survived the second fermentation intact, their contents bright and lively. Others still shattered without warning. Pérignon refused to be discouraged. To him, each failure was a lesson, a note to be recorded, a step toward understanding. There were moments of unexpected beauty in his experiments. One afternoon, in the quiet of the cellar, he poured a surviving bottle into a goblet. The wine shimmered pale gold, bubbles rising in graceful streams. He lifted it to his nose, inhaled the delicate aroma, and for the first time, thought of the sparkle not as a flaw, but as a gift waiting to be understood. His fellow monks were not entirely convinced. To them, the abbey's wine was meant to be still, pure, and clear. The popping corks and broken glass were nuisances, and the fizziness felt strange. But Pérignon, with his gentle persistence, began to share the more pleasant bottles with them, letting the wine speak for itself. Over the months, Pérignon refined his methods. He found that certain grape blends were more resistant to violent secondary fermentation. Stronger bottles and better corks reduced the risk. The storage depth in the cellar mattered more than he had realized. Slowly, the losses diminished, and the number of successful bottles grew. The work was painstaking, and the rewards were subtle. But in Pérignon's eyes, each unbroken bottle was a triumph. He began to imagine a future where this sparkling wine might not be feared, but sought after, a drink of beauty and celebration, born from the same patience that guided the tending of the vines. Spring returned, and with it, another test. Pérignon bottled a new vintage using his latest adjustments, storing them in the deepest part of the cellar. Weeks passed without incident. When he finally opened one, the cork leapt with a joyful pop, and the wine within danced like sunlight in the glass. The monk smiled. The battle was not yet won, but he had learned something vital: the sparkle could be controlled. The chaos could be shaped into elegance. What had once been the abbey's greatest nuisance might become its proudest achievement. Outside, the vines of Champagne awoke from their winter sleep, tiny green shoots unfurling under the warming sun. The cycle would begin again, and with it, Pérignon's experiments, each season bringing him closer to a wine unlike any the world had yet known. The first time Dom Pérignon opened a bottle and wanted to see the bubbles, he did so in silence. The cellar was still and cool, lit only by a single candle on the workbench. He eased the cork from the neck with slow, deliberate turns. It came free with a crisp pop, the sound sharp in the stone chamber. A faint mist rose from the opening, curling upward like a ghost. He poured the wine into a wide-bowled goblet. It fell in a thin, steady stream, but the moment it touched the glass, something marvelous began. Tiny beads raced upward from invisible points at the base, gathering speed until the whole surface shimmered with life. Pérignon leaned closer. The light from the candle broke into a constellation across the surface. The wine seemed to breathe, alive, restless, joyous. He lifted it to his nose, inhaling aromas that were somehow fresher, brighter than before: apple blossom, baked bread, a faint mineral whisper from the chalky soil of the Marne. The first sip was a revelation. It was the wine he knew, structured, balanced, a harmony of grapes, but it carried something new, a lightness that danced across the tongue, a brightness that lingered long after the swallow. The sensation was as much a sound as a taste, the whisper of bubbles, the faint hiss in the glass. He set the glass down and listened. In the stillness, the wine sang, a faint crackle and fizz, like rain beginning to fall on a distant roof. It was a sound he had once dreaded. Now, it was a promise. Pérignon began sharing the intentional sparkle with select guests of the abbey, nobles, merchants, visiting clergy. The reactions varied: surprise, laughter, even disbelief. Some thought it a miracle, others a delightful accident. A few compared it to drinking the stars. He noticed something else: people lingered over this wine. They sipped more slowly, held the glass to the light, watched the bubbles rise. The sparkles seemed to invite contemplation, as if the wine had become not just a drink, but a performance. The bottling process became more deliberate. Each bottle chosen for sparkling wine was the strongest available. The corks were selected from the finest batches imported from Spain, bound with twine in a cross pattern to hold them firm. The bottles were stored in the deepest cellars, where the temperature shifted little across the seasons. The sparkle was no longer an intruder, it was the goal. Yet it still required patience. Not every bottle developed the same liveliness. Some remained stubbornly flat, others overzealous to the point of bursting. But more and more, the results were just right: lively, fine bubbles that lifted the wine without overwhelming it. Word began to spread beyond Hautvillers. Merchants carried tales of the abbey's strange wine, one that hissed in the glass and seemed to sparkle in the light. Some dismissed it as a curiosity. Others, especially in England, embraced it with enthusiasm, for they had already developed a taste for the lively drink. Pérignon remained cautious. He did not boast, and he resisted claims that he had invented this phenomenon. In truth, nature had done that. His work was in shaping it, refining it, making it consistent. He did not see himself as a creator, but as a steward. Still, there was joy in his work. On certain evenings, after the day's prayers and labors were done, he would open a bottle for the monks, pouring each glass with care. The room would fill with the gentle chorus of popping corks, fizzing wine, and soft laughter. The sparkle had been tamed, not completely, but enough that it could be trusted. And with trust came possibility. For the first time, Dom Pérignon imagined this wine not only in the hands of the abbey's guests, but in the courts of France itself. Outside, the seasons turned again. In the vineyard, the vines began their slow climb toward another harvest. But in the cool stone below, something entirely new had been born, a wine that danced in the glass, sang in the ear, and carried the taste of the Champagne hills in every bubble. Dom Pérignon, once a man chasing perfection in stillness, had now found beauty in motion. And the world, though it did not yet know it, was about to follow. It was late afternoon in the refectory when Dom Pérignon decided to unveil the newest bottles. The long wooden table was bare except for a few candles, their flames swaying gently in the cool draft from the stone walls. A dozen monks gathered, some curious, others skeptical, their hands folded as if awaiting a sermon rather than a drink. Pérignon took one of the bottles in hand, feeling the faint tension within, the promise held under cork and twine. With practiced care, he loosened the binding, gripped the cork, and twisted gently. The cork leapt free with a clean, confident pop, releasing a wisp of fragrant mist into the air. The scent arrived first. It was light yet layered, fresh orchard apples. A hint of pear, the soft perfume of white flowers, and beneath it all a warm, bread-like richness from the fermentation. The monks leaned forward, noses twitching in curiosity. the wine caught the candlelight as it streamed into each goblet, throwing glints of pale gold across the table. As the liquid settled, tiny bubbles began their climb from the bottom, rising in steady ribbons that shimmered like threads of light. When the first monk raised his glass, he hesitated, watching the surface tremble with countless points of light. Pérignon gestured gently, and the man took a sip. His eyes widened. The bubbles seemed to burst softly against the tongue, carrying flavors upward into the nose: crisp apple, warm brioche, a mineral brightness that left the mouth clean and eager for more. One by one, the others followed. Some smiled quietly, others gave low murmurs of approval. The drink was unlike any wine they had known. It was both familiar and transformed, like hearing a well-loved hymn played on a new instrument. Dom Pérignon sipped last. He had tasted his sparkling wine before, but this moment was different. Here, in the communal hall, surrounded by the voices and faces of his brothers, the wine felt complete. It was not only a drink, it was an experience, shared, enjoyed, remembered. Outside of the abbey, the wine took on a life of its own. Merchants described it to customers in marketplaces. "It is like tasting the morning air after a frost," one said. "Like holding a handful of stars in your mouth," said another. These words were fanciful, but they were not wrong. In the goblet, the sparkle seemed to slow time. Drinkers found themselves staring at the endless ascent of bubbles, each one bursting softly at the surface. The taste lingered long after the swallow, as if the bubbles carried memory along with flavor. Some described a warmth in the chest after drinking, not from the alcohol alone, but from the brightness of the flavor. It was a wine that seemed to lift the spirit as much as it pleased the senses. There were those, of course, who still preferred the still wines, predictable, untroubled, traditional. But for others, the sparkle was irresistible. Once tasted, it was hard to forget. The wine seemed to promise something more than refreshment. It hinted at celebration, even when drunk in quiet rooms. Dom Pérignon continued refining the taste. He aimed for balance, bubbles fine enough to be delicate, acidity bright but not sharp, sweetness only enough to round the edges. The wine was not meant to overpower, but to invite another sip, and another. Evenings in the abbey sometimes ended with a shared bottle. The monks would talk in low voices, the candle flames flickering, the soft fizz in their glasses a constant presence. In those moments, the abbey felt not just like a place of prayer and work, but of quiet joy. The taste of the new drink carried with it the fields, the soil, the seasons of champagne. Every sip was a memory of the vineyard under the summer sun, the pressing of grapes in autumn, the cool patience of the winter cellar. It was the land, transformed into light, and in the years to come, though the recipe would evolve and the methods would spread, those who drank it in those early days would remember the first taste, the moment the bubbles met the tongue, and the wine became something entirely new. The abbey's wine was alive, bubbling, breathing, changing with each passing week. But without the right vessel, it could not be tamed. Dom Pérignon had learned that lesson early. Corks, for instance, were fickle things. Too loose, and the wine would lose its sparkle. Too tight, and the bottle might burst under pressure. He experimented with corks carved from oak bark, but they crumbled. Then he tried imported cork from Portugal, dense, elastic, able to hold its seal. Glass, too, was a trial. Ordinary bottles of the time were thin and uneven, prone to shattering under the strain of fermentation. Pérignon began working with glassblowers who could craft bottles with thicker walls. Their forms slightly squat to handle the pressure. The glass had to be not just strong, but consistent. No weak points, no hidden air bubbles that might spell disaster. Dom inspected each bottle by holding it up to the light, turning it slowly, as if reading secrets hidden within the green walls. Sealing the bottle became an art form of its own. The cork was pressed in by hand, then secured with twine, sometimes dipped in wax for an extra layer of safety. Over time, the monks began using stronger hemp cords, crisscrossed over the cork like a woven crown, and then, patience, once sealed, the bottles could not be rushed. They were placed in the cool, dark cellars, stacked on their sides in neat rows. Here, the wine would rest for months, sometimes years, the bubbles growing finer with time. The air in those cellars was thick with the scent of yeast, damp stone, and slowly maturing wine. Monks moved quietly, checking corks for leaks, brushing away mold from the bottlenecks, listening for the faint hiss that meant a seal had failed. Occasionally, despite every precaution, a bottle would give way. The sound was sudden, a sharp crack, followed by the fizz of wine spilling onto the floor. This was why the bottles were stored apart from one another, to prevent a chain reaction of bursting glass. The losses were frustrating, but they taught Dom Pérignon where the limits lay. Over the years, he refined the corking method, the glass composition, even the cellar conditions. He understood that this was not just about making wine, it was about controlling time itself. The abbey's workshop became a place of quiet innovation. Monks shaved corks to precise sizes, twisted twine into tighter braids, polished the necks of bottles so the seal would be perfect. Every detail mattered, because every failure meant losing not just wine, but months of patient work. Dom Pérignon's hands grew to know the feel of a proper cork, the sound of a healthy seal, the subtle weight difference between a bottle ready for rest and one still in need of filling. This was craftsmanship that could not be rushed or faked. It was learned through years of touch, sight, and patience. Some evenings, after the day's work was done, he would walk through the cellar alone, running his fingertips along the cool glass, listening to the silence. It was a silence filled with invisible movement, the slow alchemy of yeast and sugar working in darkness. The cellars became not just storage, but guardians of the abbey's reputation. Word had already spread of the strange, sparkling drink, and visitors sometimes asked to see where it was born. Dom obliged, but always with a warning: what you see is not yet ready to drink. You must wait. For Dom Pérignon, the making of wine was as much about restraint as it was about action. Every cork tied, every bottle stacked, every moment in the dark cellar was a commitment to the future, a silent promise that when the time came, the wine would be worth the wait. Even years later, when other winemakers would adopt his methods, they would speak of his discipline. It was not the easiest way, nor the fastest. But it was the way that made a bottle sing when finally opened, and so the cycle continued: grapes to juice, juice to wine, wine to bottles, bottles to cellar, and the cellar, patiently holding its treasure, waiting for the moment when the cork would once again leap into the air and the wine would meet the light. The abbey had always been a world apart: stone walls, candlelight, the measured rhythm of prayer and labor. But now, something from within those walls was beginning to echo far beyond them. Bottles of the strange, sparkling wine found their way into the hands of merchants, noblemen, and courtiers. At first, it was curiosity. Letters arrived at the abbey with polite requests: could a few bottles be sent for a wedding feast? A royal banquet? A christening? Dom Pérignon agreed only when he felt the wine was ready, and never in great quantity. When the first bottles reached Versailles, they caused a sensation. The court of Louis XIV was obsessed with novelty: fabrics from the Orient, porcelain from China, spices from the Indies. And here was something entirely new from within France itself, a wine that sparkled. At the king's table, courtiers raised their glasses, watching the tiny streams of bubbles rise in the clear crystal. The first sip brought murmurs of delight, the second laughter. It was said the king himself remarked on the wine's brightness, its freshness, unlike anything he had tasted. Word spread quickly through the salons and corridors. Champagne became a whisper passed from one noble to another, a shared secret among the most privileged. Those who possessed it were envied, those who did not scheme to obtain it. The abbey received more and more requests. Many of them thinly disguised demands from powerful patrons. Some arrived with gifts, gold coins, fine cloth, even exotic fruits, hoping to persuade Dom Pérignon to part with a few bottles. Dom Pérignon was wary. He knew that too much attention could bring trouble, that the abbey's purpose was not to serve the vanity of kings but the glory of God. Still, he recognized that such demand could bring wealth to the monastery, funding repairs, books, and food for the poor. By the early 1700s, champagne had become a fixture at royal celebrations. It was poured at weddings, christenings, and treaty signings. Its effervescence became a symbol of joy, and its rarity a mark of prestige. The king's court even developed elaborate etiquette around it, the correct way to hold the glass, the precise moment in a toast to sip, the art of praising the wine without seeming too eager. Inevitably, rival winemakers attempted to imitate it. Bottles from other regions appeared, some decent, many disastrous. A few even exploded during transport to Versailles, much to the amusement of Dom's supporters. Dom Pérignon never traveled to Versailles himself. He sent his wine. But he remained in Hautvillers, content in his quiet labor. He let the drink speak for him, and it did so eloquently. To the nobles, champagne was a luxury. To Dom, it was the result of discipline, prayer, and countless hours of work in vineyard and cellar. The two visions could not have been more different, yet they were bound together by each rising bubble in the glass. Sometimes, when a royal courier came to collect the next precious shipment, Dom would hand over the bottles with a simple blessing, "May it bring joy." He never mentioned his own name, though by now, others did, and often, the abbey's name, and Dom Pérignon's, were now whispered in the same breath as Versailles. The wine that had begun as a careful experiment in the Marne Valley was now shaping the taste of the most powerful people in France, and yet, Dom knew the attention could not last forever. Trends faded. Courts moved on. But he believed the wine would endure, because it carried within it not just novelty, but something eternal, patience, precision, and joy. The name of Dom Pérignon now traveled on the lips of nobles and merchants across France, yet the man himself walked the abbey corridors as he always had, head slightly bowed, hands clasped behind his back, eyes attentive to the smallest detail. At Hautvillers, time seemed to move differently. The vineyards still demanded the same patient care, the cellars still breathed their cool damp air, and the chapel bells still marked the hours with unbroken regularity. Dom Pérignon's life was a long chain of such days, each much like the one before, yet he knew his years were drawing to an end. Visitors came now with a new kind of reverence. They did not come merely to taste the wine, they came to meet the monk. To see the man who had invented champagne, though Dom himself never used the phrase, to witness the hands that had blended grapes with such precision, to carry away a story along with their bottles, he met each guest with the same humility. There was no theatrical flourish, no claim to genius, only quiet explanations about soil, temperature, and the nature of patience. God gives us the grapes, he would say, but we must learn how to listen to them. The fame that surrounded him brought mixed feelings. He knew that wealth and attention could corrupt even the purest work. Already, other winemakers used his name without permission, claiming their bottles were made in his manor. The myth of Dom Pérignon was growing faster than the truth. Still, the abbey benefited. Repairs were made to crumbling walls. The library received new manuscripts. Extra wine was sent to nearby villages to support the poor during hard winters. In this way, Dom reconciled himself to the world's fascination. If it could be turned toward good, it was worth bearing. In his later years, his work became slower, but no less precise. He still walked the vineyards, leaning more heavily now on his cane. He still blended the wines by smell and taste alone, his senses honed by decades of practice. Some nights, he would linger in the cellar long after the other monks had gone, running his hand along the bottles in the cool dark, as though greeting old friends. He spoke to them softly, whether in prayer or conversation, no one knew. As his health declined, the abbot urged him to rest. Dom refused. "When God calls me," he would say with a faint smile, "he will find me at work." The monks of Hautvillers noticed his increasing frailty. They began to assist him more, carrying crates, lifting barrels, and fetching tools. But they also saw the spark in his eyes whenever a new vintage was tasted, a reminder that his passion was not fading with his strength. By now, tales of his skill had reached beyond France. Merchants from England, Spain, and the Netherlands sought to buy his wine. He turned away most of them, preferring to keep the work small, controlled. His vision was not of mass production, but of perfection. On his final spring, the vineyards bloomed early. Dom walked them slowly, pausing often to rest, his hand brushing the blossoms. He seemed to know he would not see these grapes ripen. "They are in God's hands now," he murmured, when the end came in September 1715. It was quiet. He passed in his chamber, with a rosary in his hands and the sound of the abbey bells tolling in the distance. The monks carried him to his rest in the abbey church, laying him in the earth of the place he had served for nearly half a century. In the years that followed, his name became legend. The man himself, humble, precise, patient, was often replaced in memory by a mythic figure who had invented champagne in a single stroke. But those who had known him understood the truth. It was not invention, but devotion, that had made his wine endure. Somewhere in the abbey cellar, a cork popped, and bubbles rose in a glass. Life went on. The centuries after Dom Pérignon's death carried his wine far beyond the rolling hills of Champagne. What had once been the guarded secret of a humble abbey cellar became the drink of courts, then of merchants, and eventually of the world. The method he perfected, careful blending, secondary fermentation in the bottle, was refined and expanded by others. Houses like Moët Chandon, Beauve-Cliquot, and Bollinger rose in the region, each building upon the foundation laid in Hautvillers. The wine grew brighter, more consistent, more exuberant, but the principle was the same: patience rewarded with sparkle. By the 19th century, champagne was no longer merely a drink, it was a statement. A bottle on the table declared success, sophistication, and the means to afford both. At weddings, treaties, and royal coronations, champagne was the liquid punctuation to history. Steamships and railways carried it farther and faster than ever before. What once took weeks by cart could now be shipped to London in days, to New York in weeks. Soon, it appeared in the parlors of Boston, the salons of St. Petersburg, and the tea houses of Tokyo. The world wars threatened the vineyards and cellars of Champagne, yet the wine survived. Bottles were hidden underground, and the people of the region guarded their vines fiercely. When peace returned, Champagne emerged from the rubble almost as a symbol of resilience itself. The mid-20th century transformed Champagne once again. Air travel shrank distances, and Champagne became a staple on ocean liners, airplanes, and in the lobbies of glamorous hotels. Hollywood embraced it, and movie stars were photographed with coupe glasses in hand, bubbles catching the light of flashbulbs. Champagne found its way into moments of victory, on podiums at the Monaco Grand Prix, at the launch of ships, in the locker rooms of world champions. The pop of a cork became shorthand for triumph, yet for all its grandeur, Champagne never lost its intimacy. Lovers toasted anniversaries by candlelight with it. Friends opened bottles on quiet balconies. A single glass could still carry the same quiet magic that Dom Pérignon once nurtured in his abbey cellar. Then came the modern era, an age of mass production, celebrity endorsements, and billion-dollar brands. Yet, among the noise, certain bottles still carried the lineage of Hautvillers, made with the same deliberate care and the same belief that wine should be poetry in liquid form. Every December 31st, as the final seconds of the year count down, millions of people across the globe reach for the same drink. The cork pops, the foam rises, and the glass catches the light of fireworks. It's a ritual older than most who perform it realize. Few think of the quiet monk in the hills of Champagne, yet his fingerprints are on every celebration. From the grand halls of Versailles to the humblest kitchen table, his work echoes in the sparkle of each glass. In a way, Champagne has outgrown any one man. It belongs to the moments it marks, the births and weddings, the victories and farewells. But in another way, every cork is still an echo of Hautvillers, a soft reminder that even the smallest place can send ripples across centuries. Champagne is the drink of beginnings. It starts the year, the marriage, the adventure. And perhaps that is why it feels so fitting. It was born, after all, from a man who believed in the slow unfolding of perfection, from abbey cellar to global celebration, from whispered prayer to roaring crowd. The journey is long, but the thread is unbroken. The glass in your hand is not just a drink. It is history, patience, and joy distilled, and somewhere, as the corks fly and the laughter swells, perhaps Dom Pérignon's spirit leans in to whisper once more, "Come quickly, I am tasting the stars." Another whisper from the past, now fading into the night. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more sleepy stories from history. And until next time,